3,800 years. That is the number you need to keep in your head. 3,800 years ago, in the dust of Mesopotamia, someone pressed a reed into wet clay to write a poem. And ever since, modern humans, in their infinite, desperate arrogance, have been trying to convince themselves that this poem is a recipe. Oh look, Theodore, it's a step-by-step guide to brewing. How quaint! Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. Welcome back to 7,000 Beers Later. I'm Theodore, and today we are looking at the so-called hymn to Ninkasi. Now the romantics among you, and I know you're out there, you view this as a sacred transmission of lost knowledge, a historical detective mystery, if you will. But let's look at the data, shall we? Because the data doesn't care about your feelings. The hymn to Ninkasi is an artifact from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1800 BC. It is dedicated to Ninkasi, the Sumerian goddess of beer, born of flowing water. Lovely imagery, truly moving. But here is the snag. Scholars like Miguel Civil, God rest his soul, translated this text in 1964 and presented it as a recipe, a blueprint. But then you have the skeptics, like Peter Damerow from the Max Planck Institute, a man after my own heart. He looked at this recipe and essentially said, "This is useless." Why? Because it's poetry, you dullards. It's a song of praise, not a technical manual. Imagine trying to bake a souffle using only the lyrics to a pop song. Beat it, just beat it. You see my point? You end up with a mess. Now, to understand why this matters, you have to understand the Sumerians. They weren't hipster craft brewers with waxed moustaches. They were bureaucrats, obsessive, wonderful bureaucrats. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was currency, it was wages. We have administrative tablets, my favourite kind of tablets, recording that temple labourers in Uruk received exactly 1.75 litres of beer per day. 1.75, not a pint or so. Precision. If you were a high-ranking official, 5 times that amount. Beer was the oil in the engine of the earliest civilization. It was so important that the Code of Hammurabi, 1755 BC, decreed that if a tavern keeper overcharged you, she would be drowned. A harsh penalty for a watery pint, but I suppose it kept standards high. So in a society that documented everything, every litre of barley, every jar of malt, why is there no written recipe for beer? Archaeologists have found thousands of administrative texts about beer ingredients. Thousands. But not one recipe. It's the administrative text paradox, as Damerow called it. The answer is obvious, though it seems to elude the romantics. They didn't write it down because everyone already knew how to do it. You don't need a recipe for toast. You don't need a recipe for ice water. And if you were a Sumerian, you didn't need a recipe for beer. It was industrial scale knowledge. But that didn't stop the moderns from trying to decode the hymn. And this is where it gets linguistically infuriating. The debate hinges on a few words, specifically the word Bappir. Bappir. Civil translates it as beer bread, a twice-baked barley loaf you could store for years and then crumble into the mash. Makes sense, very practical. But then comes Walter Salleberger. He translates Bappir as sourdough. Think about that. If Bappir is sourdough, a live culture, and the hymn explicitly says you put it in a big oven, you kill the yeast! You cannot bake a starter culture in a big oven and expect it to ferment anything. It's basic biology. But Salleberger insists. And then you have Veronika Afanasieva, who translates the word Titab as wort. The hymn says you spread Titab on reed mats to cool. Have you ever tried to spread a sugary liquid on a reed mat? It runs through the holes, into the dirt. It is physically impossible. Yet these are the translations we are working with. It's a Rorschach test. We see what we want to see. Which brings us to 1989, the Sumerian Beer Project. Fritz Maytag of Anchor Brewing, a legend, I'll give him that, teams up with Solomon Katz. They decide to brew the hymn, to resurrect Ninkasi. It sounds noble. It really does. But let's look at the compromises, shall we? Because history is a series of disappointments. First, the sweetener. The hymn mentions honey and wine. The team figured, correctly, that in Mesopotamia, honey usually meant date syrup. Smart, accurate. But wait! The California state government steps in. Regulations said you couldn't use dates in a product labelled beer. So what did they do? They used bee honey. Because nothing says authentic ancient Sumerian experience like adhering to 1989 California labelling laws. And then, the yeast. The Sumerians relied on wild yeast, spontaneous fermentation, lactobacillus, wild Saccharomyces. It would have been sour, complex, funky, a mixed culture. But Anchor Brewing? They wanted a product people could actually drink without grimacing, so they used a pure, modern laboratory strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. They sanitized the past. They took a wild, unpredictable bacterial soup and turned it into a clean, safe ale. They brewed a lie. A tasty lie, I'm sure, but a lie. So what did this lie taste like? They served it at a conference in San Francisco, from large ceramic jars with straws. Nice touch, that. The verdict? 3.5% alcohol. No hops. Obviously hops weren't used then. It wasn't bitter. It was dry, like a hard cider. Smelled like honey and bread. Cloudy as a London fog because it was unfiltered. People were fascinated. Of course they were. It's a good story. I drank the beer of the goddess. No, you didn't. You drank Fritz Maytag's best guess based on a poem that might not even be a recipe, using the wrong yeast and the wrong sweetener. You see, the Sumerian Beer Project didn't prove the hymn was a recipe. It proved that we can never truly go back. We are trapped in our own time. We interpret Bappir as bread because we know what bread is. We use lab yeast because we are terrified of bacteria. We project our own logic onto a world of gods and mud and reed mats. The beer they made, it wasn't Sumerian beer. It was Anchor Brewing's 1989 interpretation of the hymn to Ninkasi. A bit less catchy on the label, I suppose. The hymn ends with a line about the beer pouring out like the onrush of the Tigris and Euphrates, a flood of joy. Perhaps we should leave it at that, a metaphor, a feeling. But no, I'm sure next week someone will try to recreate the bread of Enkidu using a 3D printer and a sourdough starter from San Francisco. We learn nothing. Absolutely nothing. Until next time. Cheers.